King, the most unexpected thing about you, to me, is that for a long time you've been a national leader of your people. You're one of the most influential figures, I suppose, in the United States, and yet you're only 32 years old. Now, did you have any special training for this kind of leadership when you were a boy?
No, I really didn't. I had no idea that I would be catapulted into a position of leadership in the civil rights struggle in the United States. I went through the discipline of early elementary school education and then high school and college and theological training, but never did I realize that I would be in a situation where I would be a leader in what is now known as the civil rights struggle of the United States.
Is your father, who's also a Baptist pastor, as I know, is he a social reformer as well as a minister, or is he less interested in this side of it?
Well, he's quite interested, actually. He has had an actual interest in civil rights across the years. He is a pastor of a large church in Atlanta, Georgia. Incidentally, I'm co-pastor of the church. And he has had a strong interest in civil rights. He has been president of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in Atlanta. And he always stood out in social reform.
Do you think he saw that you would be a leader? And do you think he did, in fact, bring you up in some special way to face these responsibilities?
Well, I think he certainly realized the need for this. And after I decided to enter the ministry, he constantly stressed the need for leadership. And I'm sure that he hoped that I would stand out in this area. Whether he realized that I would do it or not is something else, but he certainly hoped for this.
What sort of home did you have as a child? Was it a strict home, for instance?
Well, I guess it was a relatively strict coming up in a minister's home. I faced the discipline that you would face in a very fervent religious background. However, I don't think it was over strict to the point that I developed any personality conflicts as a result of my early childhood, but it was strict enough, and I think it was strict enough for me to develop certain disciplinary principles as I came up.
Were you a quick starter at your lessons?
Yes, I would say generally I was. Interestingly enough, I didn't start out with an interest to enter the ministry. At first, after finishing high school, I was interested in going into law and also medicine at one point. And all along, I received fairly good grades. But finally, I decided to enter the ministry and then went on to theological school.
Well, now, when you were still a small boy, before those decisions came along, were you conscious of color discrimination in your own life?
Yes, I became conscious of color discrimination at a relatively early age. I think the first time was when I was about 6 years old. I had some friends who lived, well, they didn't live in front of us, but their parents had a store, 2 white boys, and they were my inseparable playmates for the early years of my life. And I remember when I was about 6, something started happening. When I went over to play with them, they always made excuses. They could not play. They were busy. And finally, I went to my mother with this problem, and she tried to explain to me in the best way she could explain to a child 6 years old. And this was really the first time that I became aware of the racial differences, or really the racial problem. She made it clear to me that this system had a long history, dating back to the time of slavery. She tried to explain the meaning of the system of segregation. But the thing I would always remember is that in the midst of her explanation, she always said to me, you must never feel that you are less than anybody else. You must always feel that you are somebody, and you must feel that you are as good as anybody else. And of course, this came up with me in spite of the fact that I still confronted the system of segregation every day.
Was that a violent conflict in your life? If you really believed your mother and yet the system around you suggested that this wasn't true, it must have set up some sort of strain.
Yes, I think so. As I look back over those early days, I did have something of an inattention. On the one hand, my mother taught me that I should feel a sense of somebodyness. On the other hand, I had to go out and face a system which stared me in the face every day saying, you are less than, you are not equal to. So this was a real tension within.
Now, out of your own personal experience, the only example you've given me so far is one family where the mother didn't too much care to have you play with her children. What were you really prevented from doing as a child that a white child might have done?
Well, in my days in Atlanta as a child, there was a pretty strict system of segregation. For instance, I could not use the swimming pool, so that for a long, long time I could not go in swimming until the YMCA was built, a Negro YMCA, and they had a swimming pool there. But certainly a Negro child in Atlanta could not go to any public park. I could not go to the so-called white schools. There were separate schools. And I attended a high school in Atlanta, which was the only high school for Negroes in the city. And this was a real problem because in Atlanta there are more than 200,000 Negroes. In many of the stores downtown, to take another example, I could not go to a lunch counter to buy a hamburger, a cup of coffee, or something like that. I could not attend any of the theaters. Only there were one or two Negro theaters. They were very small, but they did not get the main pictures. If they got them, they were 2 years late or 3 years late. So that by and large, there was a very strict system of segregation, and there was nothing called racial integration at that time in Atlanta.
Now, that's a description of the system. Was anybody actually cruel to you or violent to you because you were colored?
Yes, we did confront some of those problems. I remember as a child seeing problems of police brutality, and this was mainly aimed at Negro children and Negro adults. I can remember also the organization that is known as the Ku Klux Klan. This is an organization that stands on white supremacy, and an organization that in those days even used violent methods to preserve segregation and to keep the Negro in his place, so to speak. Now, I can remember seeing the Klan actually beat Negroes on some of the streets in Atlanta.
But nobody ever beat you personally?
No, I did have one experience, which was a relatively minor experience, but it still lived with me a good deal. When I was about 8 years old, I was in one of the downtown stores of Atlanta, and all of a sudden someone slapped me, and the only thing I heard was somebody saying, you are that nigger that stepped on my foot. And it turned out to be a white lady. And of course I didn't retaliate at any point. I finally went and told my mother what had happened, and she was very upset about it. But at that time, the lady who slapped me had gone, and my mother and I left the store almost immediately.
Can you remember at this distance of time why you didn't respond in any violent way? Was it that you'd already thought of nonviolence, or was it that you just didn't dare as a Negro to take any strong action against a white?
Well, I think probably it was a combination of two things. I hadn't thought of nonviolence at that early age as a system of thought, as a practical technique. I think a great part of it was that I just didn't think I wouldn't dare retaliate or hit back when a white person was involved. And I think some of it was a part of my native structure, so to speak, and that is that I have never been one to hit back too much.
Well, now, that's all, 20 years or so ago, I suppose.
Yes.
But how bad is the complaint today? After all, the United States has changed a lot. The Negro's rights are protected under the law. What exactly, how much has this system changed between then and now?
Well, it has changed a good deal. It is far from what it ought to be, but I can see many, many changes that have taken place over the last few years. For instance, in the same Atlanta, Georgia, which is one of the largest cities in the South, there are some Negro students in formerly all-white schools. Some of the parks are integrated, some of the public parks. Just a few weeks ago, about 177 lunch counters were open to Negroes on a thoroughly integrated basis. I think I could say also that court injustice is not as glaring a reality today as it was 10 years ago. Police brutality has diminished a great deal. So that in Atlanta alone, there are many changes, and when I look over the total situation, I can say the same thing. For instance, when the United States Supreme Court rendered the decision declaring segregated schools unconstitutional in 1954, 17 states and the District of Columbia practiced segregation in the public schools. But today, I would say most of these states have made some move toward integration. Only 3 states are holding out, namely the states of Mississippi, Alabama, and South Carolina.
Yes.
So that there has been a great change since, say, 1950 or 1945.
Now, I can't help following you up at one point there. You said, I think I'm quoting you more or less verbally correctly, you said that denial of justice was less glaring than it used to be, and that police brutality had, I think your words were, somewhat diminished. Now, it follows from that you're not content that the Negro gets justice in the United States as things are at present, and you're not certain that the police do not victimize him.
Well, yes, I think we have moved on a great deal, but we still face token integration. By token integration, I mean a few Negroes getting justice in a particular situation, but the vast majority still confronting problems of economic insecurity and social isolation. So that while we have moved on, we only have token integration. And the problem now is to move from token integration to overall integration, where it involves more than just a few students in a school, more than just a few lunch counters open, more than gaining justice in the courts in a few situations, but in every situation.
You spoke a moment ago about having been thrust forward into this position of leadership. How exactly did it happen? Why are you at 32 virtually the leader of the Negroes in the United States?
Well, I started out as a pastor in Montgomery, Alabama, which is a state that adjoins the state of Georgia. After I finished my graduate work in Boston, I returned to Montgomery to pastor a church. After I had been in Montgomery about a year, we had the problem there of facing many indignities and injustices on the city buses. Negroes were treated in a very discourteous manner. The bus drivers usually talked to Negro passengers in a very inhuman way. Not only that, if one had visited Montgomery, Alabama prior to 1955, December of 1955, he would have seen Negro passengers actually standing over empty seats. This was because the first 10 seats were reserved for whites only. And even if Negro passengers packed the buses and the other seats, and there were no more seats left other than these seats reserved for whites only, Negro passengers could not sit there. So they had to stand over these seats even if a white passenger was not on the bus. Not only that, there were times when Negro passengers got on the buses at the front and put the fare in the box, and then they had to get off the bus and board by the rear entrance. These were some of the conditions that existed, and on the 5th of December in 1955, a Negro woman was arrested, Mrs. Rosa Parks, for refusing to give up her seat for a boarding white male passenger. Pretty soon after she was arrested, the word got around the Montgomery community, and there was a spontaneous reaction. I think I could say safely that more than 99% of the Negro people of Montgomery rose up with a bit of indignation, a righteous indignation, I would say. And this led to the bus boycott. The Negro citizens decided not to ride the buses until these conditions were changed. They asked me to serve as a spokesman and the president of the Montgomery Improvement Association, and from this time,